This is Perspectivas Latinas, a community service of CAN TV. I'm your host, Juan Carlos Hernandez. Have you ever heard of Julia Pastrana? Until very recently, I hadn't either. Yet the sad story of this Mexican woman who died more than 150 years ago has become the subject of several plays and works of art. This fall, Chicago's Colectivo El Pozo has made her the center of their production. The Inexplicable Pastrana. Today we have Nancy Garcia, Eric Wang, and Jessica Kadish to talk about the work. Welcome.
Thank you.
Sorry about messing that up, but
I mess it up every time. I'm not kidding. I always tell Raúl, you're in charge of all these inexplicables in
Inexplicable Pastrana.
any conversation. Oh man.
A bit of a tongue twister, but let's start off by this twisted world, I'd say sometimes, of theater, because I think it takes somewhat of a twisted person to get into it, right? Jessica?
I don't know. For me personally, oh my gosh, I forget what famous 20th century actor said something about an actor should actually be the most boring person in the world. Like you lead this super stable life and then you get all your crazy out on stage or in front of the camera. So I prescribe to that viewpoint. I'm pretty boring. No, but I love theater and I stay involved with theater and make it my both my career and my passion because I don't know, I think as our society gets more and more divided, it's harder and harder to see from each other's perspectives, and I have yet to find a way other than theater that is as direct into experiencing and really trying to understand and embody another person's perspective. So that's what I find valuable about it.
Wow. So I'm still stuck with the word boring.
No, I'm boring. I go to bed early.
Nancy, what drove you or what pulled you into this world?
For me, it was when I was younger. It kind of starts with in college, but not in theater. It just started, I focused on Latino studies and Spanish and always really liked the arts and culture and being just from a textual position. But then actually seeing all the issues play out on stage when I finally saw my first play as a pretty grown adult. And then I fell in love with it. And I was like, that's where I want to be, in the sandbox, so to speak, when it comes to all the things I learned about in school and all of those perspectives and looking at all the complexities of being Latino in the US and beyond that too, that kind of is a starting point. I liked how you got to look at that, but on a stage. And then I just started volunteering and it kind of went out from there. So I'm not a born and bred theater person. I am an imposter.
Are you boring?
Not at all.
Yes.
Despite that, theater put
She's
its
lying.
claws into you and never let you go.
Yes. Okay, I'm
They're
twisted.
loving
It's
claws.
true.
She's not boring.
So she's twisted, okay.
Boring
and twisted.
too. Yes.
Well, whatever it might be, it's kept you.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, this is something especially being involved with Pozo, it's how is it not just art for art's sake? And that's the part of Pozo
Right.
that really just keeps its claws in me, so to speak, in a loving way, right? And it's just being involved with an organization where the theater, it means something, especially to the immigrant community in Chicago. And it also eliminates the barrier of, but is the play in English? No, it's subtitled in English and it's also in Spanish. So,
Right.
People like me that are first generation, if you don't speak Spanish, I do speak Spanish, but if you don't speak Spanish, this is a type of theater that you can enjoy. One, because the issues hit home, and two, because you can enjoy it. You can take your grandparents, you can take your mom and your dad, and you can go and still not feel alienated from what's going on outstage because there's a language barrier. And more importantly, the issues hit home.
Wow.
So.
We'll talk more about Pozo and the importance of Latino theater in a bit. That's actually awesome that you're saying, but how did you get wrapped up in this world, or pulled in, or
Very interesting.
driven into?
Growing up, I always enjoyed acting recreationally, in church. I do skits and plays here and there in school, and it was just something that I enjoyed it, but just never really took it seriously. Never thought I'd pursue it, and just culture-wise, it's not something that's really, big in Asian culture, and so it was just always kind of on the side. And I think for me, just in my normal daily boring life, I work in law enforcement and fire service. And
That's not boring.
Yeah, I was like,
there's boring times, but yeah, it's not. But I really feel like the theater and the acting is a good outlet for me. It's kind of an escape for me to kind of get away from all of that's going on there. And honestly, like, I'm always looking for ways to kind of challenge myself and stretch myself with different life experiences. And I really feel like, you know, theater, especially like this story, it's really kind of tapping into things that are just as real. You know, a lot of people say like, oh, acting, everything's fake, but it's like, well, if you really look at a lot of things that, you know, we go off of the material, they're very real things. They're very, you know, basic human, you know, needs or desires that I think anybody can relate to. And I think it's just something, it's really a way for kind of an extension of my normal life, so to speak, but a way for me to kind of handle and respond to it in a different way, and one that's enjoyable and definitely very different. So.
Well, so let's talk about this woman, Julia Pastrana, and talking about reality and communicating reality in a different way. Who was she? She died more than 150 years ago. Give me some of her history, Nancy.
Actually, I'm going to pass the ball to our dramaturge,
So
script development person right over there.
You
Right.
did a lot of the research.
I did. So she and I think it's important to state that although he's not here with us for this part of the interview, that Raúl has been writing about her and researching her for years and years. You know, he's been fascinated by her story and her perspective. But Julia was a Mexican indigenous woman from the northern region of Mexico, who was sold into circus performing.
Why was she sold?
So she had a condition called, now I'm thinking in Spanish, so forgive me, give me a second.
That's
I
fine.
can only think.
Hypertrichosis. She had two conditions medically that caused an excessive growth of hair on her body, so she was called the bearded lady. She had a beard and thick black hair covering most of her body, and she also had large protruding gums. And I forget the medical term for that. So she, due to her unusual appearance and the proliferation of freak shows and carnival performances in the 19th century, there was money to be made on the way that she looked. And so she was, I believe actually she was a servant girl, or she was a working girl in the governor's mansion for a while before somebody caught her, basically, and was like, oh, I could make money off of this woman, let me. And she was sold, and she went around the US and Europe, first touring to scientists in the US and medical institutions, because that was also, as Raúl was saying earlier, the time of the proliferation of Darwin's theory, and the idea of evolution really starting to take hold, and everybody was looking for evidence that some humans were more evolved than others, or that there was some way to link apes and humans that was still living, basically. And so she was not only this seen as a carnival moneymaker for wealthy white European men, she was also seen as potentially a missing link, and she was studied extensively scientifically. So a lot of her life that we have on record is the perspectives of those almost exclusively men who exhibited her and who watched her in shows and circuses, and who studied her scientifically for their own reasons and their own motives. But we don't know a whole lot about what she thought, about her perspective and about her own feelings and thoughts, her voice. And so that's, I think, a lot of what this play tries to address is what might she have been thinking, what might her story have been.
So here in the U.S., she traveled with circuses, but she was also pricked and probed, right, by scientists here.
A lot.
Examining her. Do those records still exist of where she was, what institutions she was in? Or?
They do. I can't give a list off the top of my head, but she toured to several anatomical societies and universities, Cleveland, Boston, Baltimore. She was in, I want to say New Orleans, or maybe she just passed through there on the train. The records differ based on the historical text that you look at, but she spent a lot of time in major U.S. cities and in major European cities, both being studied and then being exhibited, because she was also a fantastically talented performer. She had a gorgeous singing voice. She could speak like 4 languages. think it was 4, it might have been 5, it's 4 or 5, and she was a good dancer. And so she also had all of these skills that people paid to see, and there was always this question of, well, is it her skills or is it her looks, or is it the fact that a woman with her looks can do all these traditionally feminine things when we don't see her body as feminine? And so many questions about her life that this play explores that, yeah.
And I guess continuing with you, and then she dies when she's in Europe, right?
She died in Moscow after giving birth to her first and only child. Her child
also died, right? Her child.
Yes,
died
the child died, I want to say 36 hours after he was born. He barely lived. And she died a few days later due to complications from childbirth. And both of them were mummified. And their bodies were then toured around the world. Actually, frighteningly recently was when it stopped. There are records of her being exhibited on like B-level kind of small town fairgrounds in the US as recently as the 1970s.
As recent as that?
As recently as the 1970s, so well within living memory. Until I think the body of her son, the mummified body of her son ended up getting stolen, but her body ended up in the basement of like a curiosity shop in Oslo in Norway, and then was transferred to a medical institute, a medical museum, until a Mexican artist, Laura Anderson Barbata, raised awareness about her condition and petitioned for the repatriation of her remains back to Mexico. And she was buried in Mexico, finally, just earlier this year.
Yeah, this past February.
Yeah, in February.
Yeah, February 13th, I believe. Wow, quite a sad story. But if it weren't for this artist, who is this artist? What's her name again? Laura Anderson Barbata. Do you know why she made this a mission of hers?
I actually don't recall off the top of my head. Most of my research around her focused on her international efforts to reach out to the government of Norway and also to collaborate with other folks from around the world. I don't actually recall exactly what her specific motivation was. She has a website where she goes into it, but I do remember her speaking about in some of her writings this idea that she really wanted to see this chapter closed of the use of the body of a woman of color for the purposes, the money-making and scientific and other purposes of essentially a white European world. She wanted to bring her body back from that world where it had been used to where she came from, to where Barbata felt that she belonged and should rest.
Right. Well, it has, at least the story of her remains has, I guess, a hopeful ending. But despite that hopeful ending, there are so many, I mean, at least from my perspective, and I guess anybody's perspective, there are a lot of gaps in her story. Things we don't know about, like you said, we don't hear her voice. Right. How do you fill in those gaps as people in theater, as actors, as writers, as researchers? What kind of license can you take and do you take to fill that in? Nancy?
I'm going to tackle this tough question more from like an organization standpoint.
Sure.
So for me, the task initially is just Pozo wants to explore theater in Spanish or bilingual theater. Of course, we always are able to reach a bilingual audience because we're subtitled anyway, usually subtitled English default, right, for the subtitles. But the work itself, we are always looking for work that somehow it's amplifying the voice of the voiceless. And how does that touch home with voices that aren't so loudly broadcast in Chicago, specifically the immigrant voices? So this story falls right into that organization mission. And even in the creative process, like, it's very important for us to collaborate. So, you know, we've brought in a lot of collaborators to this. And it's also like Raúl comes from the narrative writing genre, and he has a very poetic way of writing. It's really beautiful and it's very captivating. But how do you transfer all of that narration into something on stage that's really going to capture people's imagination? And so to that effect, you would do that by collaborating and bringing in a lot of people that have a lot of different ideas too, and having multidisciplinary artists on the project. We're really lucky to count with the directorial support of Joel Valentin Martinez. So he's a senior lecturer at Northwestern University. And he has a strong history in dance and choreography, and he's taken the reins on this project as a director, and really like he's creating now like, you know, a bit of the dream and the real world of the life of Julia Pastrana, and just breathing life into this imagination that Raúl lived in while he channeled Pastrana's character. And I mean, it's a beautiful accomplishment. I'm very excited for people to see it. And to that effect, I want to highlight that the cast members, Eric included, have had a tremendous undertaking with this play. My bow to them, because I'm fully aware, even though I am not the person going through the physical, rigorous aspect of it, of the fact that not only have they memorized the script, as Raúl wrote it and, you know, developed it with Jessica, but they've also essentially memorized a whole other script that's the choreography and all of the dance elements that Joel brought to the project. So they've had a, you know, really hard undertaking on that regard.
And I think to kind of tag along to what your question was, I think on a more personal level, in order to handle something like this, you know, yeah, she lived, you know, a long time ago, but as I think I kind of touched on before, the stuff that I think she struggled with is stuff that we struggle with today. Obviously to probably a greater extent, but things like, you know, body image, self-consciousness, insecurity, fears, you know, am I good enough? Am I pretty enough? Am I handsome enough? Do people like me for who I am, or do they just like me because of what I can give them, whether it's, you know, money, power, possessions, or status, or what? And so I think in that sense, yeah, there are the gaps that we're not really sure, but, you know, having to really place yourself, especially like as an actor and a cast member, well, how would I feel if I was being poked and prodded by a bunch of doctors and they were just kind of carting me around as some sort of piece of something, a piece of research, and how would that impact me if people were paying money? On one hand, it's like, oh great, everybody wants to see me, but then having to stop and think, well, why do they want to see me? Did they want to see me because I have all this hair in my body, I'm a woman? You know, things like even today, you know, am I going to be picked on the basketball team in gym class? Or why do people pick me? It's because I'm the tallest kid? Or is it because they like me? Or, you know, because I come from a family that's popular or famous? And I just think they're just very real, like basic human emotions that we all go through through our life. That's why I think, you know, anybody can come to this and relate to it. They don't have to have lived then or have to have been carted around in a circus to really understand a lot of what lies behind it.
Yeah.
Do you want to add something to that?
It was just at the tip of my, that it was about to this concept of, I was actually thinking of, when you mentioned basketball, I was thinking of the concept of playing, that's a lot of how we filled in the blanks that are there in the history. I think if we had wanted to just depict exactly accurately her life, you know, we could have just written a paper or written a history piece. What we wanted to do in exploring her imagination was also take artistic license, and so to that effect, we would take pieces of the text. You know, a lot of what Raúl and I did over the summer was we would just sit down in his apartment with all of the texts and all of his scripts and different passages, and we'd physically get up on our feet and I'd pace around and I'd be like, okay, so Raúl, what if, you know, these two people here are talking to each other across the room, and what happens? And there wouldn't be anything there except the one sentence of who the people were and like what year it was, but we would use all of the research that we had done to illuminate possibilities of what a scene might look like between those two people or those four people at that time. And then I think that work continues with you guys in the room with Joel and Hrinska, of that same kind of sense of play, except you're taking it into the physical as well as into the writing. How would, now that we have what's here on the page and we know all this history, how would they move? How would they speak to each other?
And I think each moment too, it also speaks, I think one of kind of the underlying things in the play is that there's the power of a moment, the power of words, the power of actions, because you know, you can go through your whole life and not be that kid picked on the basketball team, and you know, like her, it's like she went through her whole life was not the pretty one or the one that, you know, was known as being attractive, but you know, if one person comes along and, you know, tells them about their true beauty, whether it's your intelligence or of the character of who you are, that can make a huge impact that, you know, you may or may not be aware of down the road, that person is forever transformed. And so I think that's one of the really important things about this is to not always you know, be focusing on those things, but just to know that even the little things that you can say or do can just have a huge effect on somebody, and so you never know, you know, what's going to happen.
In some sense, from learning about her, I started thinking, I wonder what the people of Norway, those holding her body, is a piece of research, as you said earlier. I wonder what they thought once there were requests for her body. But it also made me think, and it's something that's not so much underlying in this play, but the question of racism and difference. What do you think it tells current audiences about her and about us to have this story and to have it from her perspective? You've taken artistic license and you're giving us her perspective. What can it tell us now? Nancy?
I think one of the things that is illuminated, as Jessica was saying about the play, is that the story of Pastrana in particular, like, it makes us also see our own intolerances. So whether these are beauty, some of those feelings of intolerance, they're going to be similar if they're rooted in beauty or they're rooted in
what we consider beautiful.
Yeah,
right?
But in country of origin, like, really the big question is, what are our intolerances as a culture? What are our prejuicios? And I think this play makes the audience member dive into that. It is a play that when people leave, they should be talking about that. They should be talking about, how do we feel nowadays about the image and the way that we view and perceive the body of a brown woman, an indigenous woman. Have we come far? Have we not? And it's rather, the play's not answering the questions for us. The play is putting us in a place where we continue to ask those questions. And we've been blessed with the participation of a researcher, the dramaturg, and cast members that are exploring those questions throughout the creative process. So some of these things, this question that you bring up, it's a wonderful question. These questions should continue beyond the Pastrana show.
Right.
People that experience the show should be asking those things, because there's also, like, even in culture, what are the intolerances in culture with Latinos? What are the things that we're prejudiced, in culture that we're not talking about? And also going back again to the, which stories are not being told, when you're over here and it's collective, and everyone's Latino, or there's predominant groups that are sort of, they sort of dominate the stories that are told in Chicago. How does this allow for just looking at things more specifically, and in the specific, and in the micro, finding tough questions and exploring answers, and just being introspective about that too.
I'm curious, during the rehearsals, but also the creative process during the rehearsals, and for you, Eric, how do you, you said touching, I guess, getting back to maybe some experiences a lot of us could identify with, particularly, I think, males or people that are just into sports, not being selected, not being picked because maybe you're not that tall. I mean, I'm not.
I can relate to that.
I'm not that tall myself.
Yeah.
So, where else in your own, you don't have to get into super personal detail, where else in your own experience have you dug up some of those emotions, some of those feelings that you want to bring out for the audience to see and the audience to feel?
I think it's, for me personally, a lot of it is just kind of coming down to, reflecting on yourself and what do you enjoy as a person, your personality. Like, for instance, myself and even doing this, I know a lot of people that I'd work with would kind of chuckle at the fact, like, hey, you're doing drama, you're doing dance and movement. That's not very, law enforcement or masculine,
and then you were
friendly.
Like, and it's a Latino theater company.
And, things like that. Yeah. And but I think it's just, I think everybody, adult, young, old, just really having to find out your own identity and exploring that. And like Nancy said, like, it's not something that we expect you're going to happen overnight, but to really just start reflecting on that and then making that choice. Okay, do I want to be and live who I am, or do I want to try to cater it in such a way whereas I kind of get it, but then it's also accepted by everybody else? And I guess for me, just in my experience in my own life, I'm kind of at the point of, I don't really care what you think, you know, so this is what I want to do, you know, not like in a mean way, but it's, you know, this
Right.
is who I am and this is what I enjoy doing, so I'm going to go do it. And if you think there's something weird or wrong with that, then, you know, then oh well. You know, if you don't want to pick me to play on your basketball team, so to speak, then I will find another team to play with. And I think that's really kind of the challenge that kind of comes out of this. It's, you know, especially in this day and age where everyone's so like instant with iPhones, everything's fast. We want the answers, and even I think something
Immediate, right?
Exactly. I think even something come to a play like this, even with questions, people will hope that, okay, well after I see the play, then this question will be answered. But you know, that's not. We're not there to kind of just give it to you in a sense. It's, we want to provoke your thought and you find the answers on your own. However that journey, that process needs to go, however you need to, you know, take to find the answers of, all right, well, how do I feel about this? I mean, we've made a lot of great strides in things like, you know, gender roles and equality and a lot of changes, but again, you know, what Nancy was saying, you know, really asking yourself, well, we've made a lot of progress, but where are we at? Do we still have some of these intolerances that have been here for years, whether it's through race or through gender or just through different opinions
class.
or prejudice? Exactly, classes. Like thinking, do you still have a perception of that, or have you really come as far as you think you have? And I think we'll be surprised as each person kind of questions in their own life and their own environment of, you know, where that progress has really come to.
Jessica, we're running out of time, but I'd like to hear from you, your thoughts. What do you think, I'm going to throw it out there, what do you think Julia would want to tell our audience right now about
Oh my gosh.
You're like,
this play and
That's such a big responsibility.
because you worked on this?
Yeah, no, I'm just, it only took like 30 seconds of research to realize how much objectification and exploitation and scientific and cultural racism was tangled up with her story. Indeed, was what shaped her story and her life. And I think that if she were here, I don't know. I like to think that she would want to have, that she would just want to have a conversation, that she would want her story to be considered and her voice to be heard, not just as, you know, this freak show moneymaker, as she was referred to. I mean, she had all kinds of, the ugliest woman in the world, the ape woman, the bear woman, all kinds of things. I like to think she would want to be referred to by her given name and would want to, like, and would just want to have a conversation with people who would look at her as a person, not as Julia, not, and that's what the play is really about, trying to explore the historical circumstances that she lived in, but also to illuminate some imagined perspectives of hers, how she might have spoken with people, how she might have loved, where she might have wanted to be buried, even, all those things.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, Jessica, Eric, Nancy.
Thank you.
Oscar.
Thanks
for having us.
Perspectivas Latinas is a community service of CAN TV. If your nonprofit organization would like to use CAN TV, call 312-738-1400 and ask for nonprofit services. Tune into Perspectivas Latinas for local issues and concerns every Thursday at 8:30 p.m. on CAN TV 21. I'm Juan Carlos Hernandez. Thank you for joining us.